Hello everyone. So in this video, we'll discuss the very, very complex theory of matter as proposed by Anaxagoras. So we've already sort of discussed it more or less, and we were trying to discuss the theory of mind without having gone into the details of this, so you have hints of it already. I'll read out a fragment 11, which is not that long a fragment, but it'll give you an idea of, and I've already started with that. This is the one that begins en panti pantos moira esti. So that in everything there is a portion of everything. This will give you an idea of what's going on, basically, and then we'll go into details of, how it's very complex, as I said, so you'll have to pay a bit of attention here. So he says, and since the portions of the great and of the small are equal in number, so too, this is fragment 6 that I'm reading out. And since the portion of the great and the small are equal in number, so too all things would be in everything. Nor is it possible that they should exist apart, but all things have a portion of everything. Since it is not possible that there should be a smallest part, nothing can be put apart, nor come to be all by itself, but as things were originally, so they must be now too, all together. In all things there are many ingredients, equal in number in the greater and in the smaller of things that are being separated off, right? Challenge to Zeno and very original theory of matter. Then fragment 11 that I've been mentioning, in which he says, in everything there's a portion of everything except mind, because mind, if you remember, is sort of not mixed. And there are some things in which there is mind as well, because mind is, for example, in us, mind is there, but it's not mixed, it's in, but sort of still maintains its sort of, separateness from us. I can't think of the word. Right, so before we go into more of the fragments and more of the details of what's going on out here, let's discuss this theory of matter just from this, right? Basically what he's saying, what is he doing? So he is posing a direct challenge to Parmenides and Zeno, as we mentioned in the first video, and he's attempting to retain the physical world, because with Parmenides and Zeno, with Parmenides, you have just this one big thing which is unmoved, doesn't have parts, doesn't have, it doesn't come into being, doesn't perish, there are all kinds of things that are happening out here. But the world we see around us is plural, it moves, things seem to come into being and perish, and so he is basically sort of posing a challenge to that. And if you remember the fragment that we read where he says, well, the Greeks are right, or maybe I did not read it, I don't remember, in which he says that the Greeks are right in maintaining that, so he says, or rather, Parmenides is right, sorry. The Greeks are wrong to recognize coming into being and perishing, for nothing comes into being nor perishes, right? So it seems that he's supporting Parmenides, but is rather compounded or dissolved from things that are. And immediately he sort of goes into the next level. So he accepts one thing of Parmenides, because remember, he accepts that there is no such thing as a void, right? Everything is in everything, so there is no gap in nature. But then he says that, well, they still sort of can be compounded and dissolved, which means motion is definitely there and parts are definitely there. So they would be right to call coming into being composition and perishing dissolution, right? So this is the one challenge to Parmenides that he's placing out here, where he says that, well, maybe they're right in maintaining that, they're wrong in maintaining that things come into being and perish into nothing, that is, but, they do mix. Yeah, so they do change. So that was one challenge to Parmenides. There are also challenges to Zeno, which we'll get to in a few seconds. Yeah, I'll keep my finger there so it is bookmarked. Right, so basically he's also attempting to in this sense, restore as far as possible the Milesian world, right? In the Milesian world, you have this, the physical matter, change, cosmology, cosmogony explained in a particular way, and the idea of, movement, matter, movement, and formation of the cosmos. So he's trying to sort of, face this Eleatic challenge, this Eleatic denial of the world, really. Right, so he basically takes on this challenge of Parmenides, and what he's claiming now is that every single natural substance that there is must be assumed to have existence in the Parmenidean sense, which means that it doesn't come into being and doesn't perish, right? There is everything in the world and nothing perishes, right? The amount of matter in the world remains the same. It's always been there and it doesn't perish. This is why is this? Sorry, because Parmenides is challenged that nothing can come from nothing. But then you can see that everything appears to be generated from something, right? From something else. So he'll say everything is generated from everything else, right? And therefore, everything must contain everything else. So we'll try and explore that further. You know, what does he mean by everything is generated from everything else and everything must come from everything else? So basically, remember Aristotle's sort of summary of Parmenides says that it cannot come from nothing because what is not, but it cannot come from what is because what is already is. So what he's saying is that, well, it can come from what is already is, but what is infinitely divisible, right? So he just refuses one, like in fact to answer Parmenides, you'll notice that every single person would sort of refuse something of the lot, right? So with Empedocles, you saw that he refused that there was only one single unique substance. He said, no, there are 4 substances at least, and there are 2 forces, right? So Empedocles is like, and anyway, Empedocles slightly more colorful and sometimes not very sort of rigorous in the same way. With Anaxagoras, you can see that what he's saying is that, well, yes, things don't come into being and perish, so what is not, we accept that. But we can, I'll add that everything is infinitely divisible. With the atomists, you'll have a different thing. So once we get there, the atomists would say what is not is, you know, it's like, well, not in the same way as Gorgias does, but there is a conception of the void. Anyway, so yeah, things come into being from things that already exist, are already present, and these things are minute and imperceptible. So we are going towards these atoms. They are infinitesimally small, and that's why they are imperceptible. And this imperceptible matter is mixed with everything else, but it's also infinitely divisible, which will cause us problems, you know, intellectually to be able to conceive of it. Why do things look different then, you know, if everything is this one single infinite matter that is mixed? Is because the proportion is different, right? Some things have, let's say, more of cloth, right? Some things have more of stone, some things have more of hair, some things have more of plastic, I don't know, like, or glass. So it's a question of proportion of things. So everything is mixed in everything, and everything is composed of this infinite matter, but what has more proportion of what, kind of an idea, right? So there is a question of what predominates numerically in the mixture when we look at the infinite number of constituents. You know, which things are more in number. And so not only is the whole mixture infinite in size, but every single particle of that mixture, if you think of the particle anyway, even though it is infinitely divisible, so the particle, the zero, as Zeno would say, the unit, cannot be found. There is no unit in Parmenides. But every like, it's difficult to even talk about, you know, things. I mean, maybe I'm like more Parmenidean than I thought I was, so everything is infinitely divisible, and so every particle has everything in it, just like the whole, which is just such an amazing idea. You know, you have the whole cosmos, the macrocosm, is contained within the microcosm, right? The microcosm is pretty much like, it reflects it not just conceptually but materially. You know, the microcosm reflects the macrocosm in matter, right? So, so the world is infinite times infinite. Now, this is an amazing idea, right? Like, even if you think about it in terms of numbers, right? It's an amazing idea because what he's basically positing is an infinity of infinity, of infinity of infinity of infinity, infinite times. You know, so there's an infinite amount of matter, infinite times, in infinite sort of like ways, kind of a thing. Right? So that's one sort of, you know, abyss to, to look down into. The other one is the idea, if you remember from Anaximander, like generally we have talked about this, that like attracts to like is like. Here you have, he has an idea of nourishment, right? This idea of nourishment, that like is nourished by like. And this idea of nourishment, and let me see if I can find the quote for this, because there's this very interesting quote about nourishment when he talks about seeds. Yeah. So this is from IISER. Yeah. Anaxagoras of Clazomenae, son of held that the first principles of things were the homoeomeres, which is, by the way, something that Aristotle comes up with. So, for it seemed to him quite impossible that anything should come into being from the non-existence or be dissolved in it. Anyhow, we take in nourishment that is simple and homogeneous, such as bread or water, and by this are nourished hair, veins, arteries, flesh, sinews, bones, and all other parts of the body. Which being so, we must agree that everything that exists is in the nourishment we take in, and that everything derives its growth from things that exist. There must be in that nourishment some parts that are productive of blood, some of sinews, some of bones, and so on, parts which reason alone can apprehend. For there's no need to refer the fact that bread and water produce all these things to sense perception. Rather, there are in bread and water parts which only reason can apprehend, right? So the idea of things being able to nourish each other, right? There is some kind of a nourishment of matter. So, in the same way as water, we would think of water as nourishing plants. And so this water that nourishes plants, how does it nourish plants? So it must contain, even infinitesimal portions of wood, bark, leaves, fruit, all of these things that constitute the plant and its infinitesimality. And that's how I think, data philosophers understood this part of everything and everything. Because the idea is that how can we think of everything being generated from everything if everything was not in everything, So this is the reason for this idea, that if everything is generated from everything, so then everything must contain a part of everything. So whatever you eat, your whole body, it's like, that sounds a bit horrible to me. It must contain bits of like flesh and sinews and bones and nails. And nails, I think somebody mentioned, Aristotle or someone. In all that we eat and drink and we take in the air. So everything that nourishes us in total contains parts of us. And so with everything in the world, right? So he has this idea of, he talks about the spermata, right? The spermata, which are the seeds of everything. So the idea is that there are seeds of all things that are mingled in everything in the world. So no matter what material you find, you will find the seeds of that in everything that is there. And everything contains both portions, I suppose, of the larger and the smaller, and contains an equal number of things because they're infinitely divisible. That means that they are infinitely large, and that's the challenge to Zeno that he's placing. And in that sense, it is divisible into our smaller pieces. In fact, fragment 3, he says, of the small, there is no smallest, but always a smaller. Remember, infinitely divisible. For what is cannot not be. So you will never get to nothing. You will never get to zero magnitude, let's say. But similarly, there's always a larger than the large, and is numerically equal to the small, whereas in relation to itself, each thing is both large and small. So this amazing and brilliant idea, I think, in which the smallest, the infinitesimal, is still sort of infinite in size, right? Infinite in number, numerically infinite, and is equal to the infinitely large, right? So the largest infinity is numerically equal to the smallest infinity. And that's what we mean by perspective, because when you think of perspective, and that's why, it's a nice sort of fiction, let's say, to think that he did write a book on perspective in painting, because the idea that when you're like thinking about it in terms of perspective, the smallest and the largest, it's just a question of like, it's a perspectival notion, right? It sort of goes into 3D, really, once you start thinking of Anaxagoras' world, and the more you focus, it might get pixelated with our current sort of technology. But if you can get to better technology, you will see that the smallest is infinitely large and it's the same size as the biggest, right? So this is his reply to Zeno, in which he says each thing is in and by itself both large because it is composed of an infinite number of parts, and small because its parts themselves are infinitesimally small, right? So the idea of infinite divisibility he takes to a next level, really. Like it's a very profound understanding of the notion of infinity, because things are infinite in quantity and at the same time infinitesimally small, but they can at the same time go on becoming smaller to infinity without becoming parts without magnitude, right? When Zeno says parts without magnitude, that will never happen, because they will get smaller and smaller, but they will still be infinite in size, right? And so in a strict concept of infinity, in Fragment 5, he says, it must be recognized that all things are neither less nor more, for there cannot be more than all, but all are equal, right? There's this very strong concept of maybe biunivocal correspondence, if you want to think of it in terms of biunivocity, but that's exactly what he's proposing out here, right? So basically he's saying that for even an infinite number is no more and no less than it is. It's a completed infinity. It's not a potential infinity. It's a completed infinity. And so an infinitely large quantity would be numerically equal to an infinitely small quantity, because they will both have the same cardinality, let's say. They'll have the same cardinality, same number, right? Because he says that things are not only infinite, but infinite times infinite, right? We have this idea of many times infinite. That means that everything, when we say everything contains everything, then the large piece of something contains as many portions as a small piece of that thing. But we do know that proportions are different, of course. So there is there's more or less, as Parmenides would say. That should not happen. There should be not more of one part and less of one part. He says no. That thesis I don't accept. He will say that everything contains everything, but not in the same proportion, right? It doesn't contain all infinite substance in the same proportion. So that set is complete. But let's say the part of the set that we're looking at in any one thing, that is to the surface, maybe, if you want to think of in terms of surfaces, is maybe, let's say one part of the set, and the other part of the set is not as prominent, right? But then also things are not entirely ever separated off, right? They're always mingled together. And when we talk about the world as having evolved by a process of separation from an original mixture of things, this rotationary motion that we're talking about, in spite of the separation that has taken place, everything still manages to contain everything else. And he says, as in the beginning, so now all things are together, right? So what is he basically doing? So he had a question, right? His question was, what sort of hypothesis can we have of the nature of matter, in which we can explain the change from one substance to another without talking about the creation of new substances, because things cannot come into being from nothing, right? And there's this thing that is forbidden by Parmenides. So he's saying, how do we explain, without breaking this one rule of Parmenides, that nothing can come from nothing, ex nihilo nihil fit, sorry, right? He answered that basically we cannot say that any form of substance is prior to another. So like Anaximander, he does not claim that you have one of the different matters, air, water, fire, whatever, is another, nor that, like Empedocles, that you can have four matters that are prior, like why do we need these four? Why do we have to name these four, right? Because he would say that in portion of any one substance, in whatever size we look at, there are already portions of all other things in quantities beneath the level of perception. And through nourishment, maybe one of them rises. Right? So the idea of spermata that he's talking about, the seeds, is basically this conception that different kinds of matter will retain in however infinitesimal quantities, in really tiny quantities, the same infinite number of ingredients of in some proportion, right? So these seeds of everything exist in everything, and this is a very strong idea of this spermata, or the seed, right? So let me see if I can find a few more fragments where he is dealing with these questions. Yeah, so one of them is, so these are in Kirk and Raven, quoted under his reaction to Parmenides and earlier pluralists. So you have one, fragment 1, really, where he says, all things were together, infinite in respect to both number and smallness, for the small too was infinite, and while all things were together, none of them were plain because of their smallness, for air and aether held all things in subjection, both of them being infinite, for these are the greatest ingredients in the mixture of all things, both in number and in size, right? So precisely what we were talking about, that all things are together and infinite in size and in number and in smallness, and you have the infinite and infinitesimal that are the same. Let me see if I can find the one against Zeno. Yeah. Fragment 3 I already read out to you. Fragment 5, where he says, and when these things have thus been separated, we must know that all things are neither more nor less, for it is not possible that there should be more than all, but that all things are always equal, right? I mean, I already mentioned this fragment to you. And then, yeah. I think we have already talked about Zeno's fragment, so we don't need to go back into that. But if you remember Zeno's fragment, where he says, if there is a plurality, there must be both small and great, so small as to have no magnitude at all, and so great as to be infinite. So basically, he's facing this challenge head on and saying, yeah, sure, why not? Let's have everything, yeah? The ones about seeds I've already sort of read out to you. There is more about seeds in which he says, well, this is somebody commenting on him, and he says, how could hair come from what is not hair, or flesh from what is not flesh? And the answer he would say is, there are seeds of hair and flesh in everything. And this one long one, really, from Aristotle, which I'm wondering whether I should read out to you at all. It's fairly long, but it helps, right? So I mean, you can also have this text later. So he says, Anaxagoras posited an infinity of principles, namely the homeomerous substance. Now, what is this homeomerous that Aristotle keeps going on about? And I've mentioned it a few times. Basically, the idea of homeomerous is, comes from meros, parts, and homeo, same, so things with like parts, right? So he says, Aristotle says, Anaxagoras sort of, have I lost that fragment that I was reading out? I feel like I've lost that fragment. Oh yeah, no, here, sorry. He posited an infinity of principles, namely the homeomerous substances and the opposites together, while Empedocles only calls them elements. The theory of Anaxagoras that the principles are infinite in number was probably due to his acceptance of the common opinion of the physicists that nothing comes into being from not being, so that's Parmenides. For this is the reason why they use the phrase all things were together. And the coming into being of such and such a kind of thing is reduced to change of quality, while others speak of combination and separation. So that's Anaxagoras and Empedocles. Moreover, the fact that the opposites proceed from each other led to the same conclusion. The one they reasoned must have already existed in the other, for since everything that comes into being must arise either from what is or from what is not, and it is impossible for it to arise from what is not, they thought that the truth of the alternative necessarily followed, namely that things come into being out of existent things, right? And so they assert that everything is mixed in everything, because they saw everything arising out of everything. But things, as they say, appear different from one another and receive different names according to the nature of the thing that is numerically predominant among the innumerable constituents of the mixture. For nothing, they say, is purely and entirely white or black or sweet or flesh or bone, but the nature of the thing is held to be that of which it contains the most. Yeah? So I'll stop here with Aristotle's sort of great fragment, where he basically now summarizes the issue that we are dealing with the question of spermata, the opposites, which are contained in everything. So it's this matter which contains things which are otherwise supposed to be contradictory and opposite and should not be together, but there are proportions of it in small quantities in the entire sort of matter. So in the next video, we'll talk about his cosmogony and his cosmology to a very small extent, and the creation of the world. Thank you.